It's easy to lash out when things don't seem to be going your way and you fear you're losing control of the world as you know it and as you like it. And if we're watching the newspapers or listening to the TV news or the radio news, you'll know there's quite a bit of that going on in the world today and in our communities today. We see a lot of it around. Orlando shootings was one example, and the Brexit dilemma has brought its own issues for Europe. And we see plenty of it in our own city. We don't have to look offshore. We see it often perhaps in more insidious ways that emerge as racism or sexism or homophobia or an expression that blames the victim. When our world, as we know it, starts to change, when we're faced with ideas and behaviors that are new to us, when our sense of control seems to be slipping, it's not uncommon to hear ourselves, and others perhaps, but ourselves, say things like, "That's shocking. It's unbelievable. It's just not possible. It's stupid. It's not right, and it's never going to happen if I can help it." Those things familiar to you? Have you ever heard yourself say any of those things or even think them? Dare you own that up? I have. Often. But it was brought home to me very vividly a week or so back when John and I went to the theatre to see that play over in the Sky City Theatre called That Bloody Woman. Anybody here seen it? Well, I have to say, I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked to my very core. I didn't expect to be, because it's a play about Kate Shepherd, I thought. That wonderful women's movement towards women's suffrage. I'm really going to enjoy it. But I was shocked. I mean, we know that the movement was successful, and in 1893, New Zealand was the first country in the world to afford women the vote. Yay! I thought, great. Their friends and their families, their churches, the politicians and the business people of the day were shocked at the goings-on of those women. And I, as I sat there in that theatre, was shocked to my very core. What were those women getting up to? You know, they were riding their bicycles around in divided skirts. They were getting petitions signed. They were speaking out in public. They were forming friendships across gender lines. They were taking charge of their own lives and their own futures. It was shocking stuff. Many didn't approve of what was going on, and many lashed out with violence and with hurtful speech. Do you know what it was that shocked me? It was the punk rock context in which that bloody woman was set. It took me by surprise. I was shocked to my core. I wondered what I had struck in the loud, discordant music and the verbal obscenities. And many of us in the audience were impacted in a visceral way, experiencing in our own bodies just how shocking 126 years ago the very thought of women speaking and organizing in public was. How very shocking and unseemly it was for women to be demanding recognition for their capacity to think and decide what was in their own and in society's best interest, perhaps even contrary to men's ideas of what was good for women or for society. And how shocking it was for the church to realize that these women, these strident feminists, had emerged out of the church itself, out of St Albans Methodist Church in Christchurch. Having seen the production, you won't be surprised to know, and having been shocked to my very core, as I've told you, I came to today's gospel able to recognize shock tactics when I saw them. What unpleasant people Luke's Jesus and his disciples must have seen to those who heard the story. First, there is a suggestion of violence by the disciples who wanted to burn up the Samaritans because they didn't want to receive Jesus, a stranger, a foreigner. Then Jesus challenges unkindly the sincerity of someone who wanted to join his group. And then he appears to reject a couple of people who want to follow him, but had one or two obligations to see to first, like taking care of the funeral arrangements for a father and saying goodbye to family. Perfectly reasonable, quite right, culturally appropriate things that it would seem. Wouldn't you have thought Jesus would be more understanding? The story suggests Jesus was very rude and his behavior shocking. No way to grow a movement. But what lies behind these aphorisms and their superficial shock? What lies beneath it? It's always important to remember that this is not a recounting of a careful historical event or a careful recounting of a historical event. It's a story in the Jesus mode that gathers together stories and aphorisms that Jesus was very fond of and puts them together into a narrative to make a point, to indicate deep truth. It was probably written in the late decades of the first century, or even the first decades of the second century, according to mainstream biblical scholars. And it's a story at a pivotal point in Luke's narration of the journey from Galilee through Samaritan territory to Jerusalem, from countryside to the seat of religious and political power. And this gospel, as you know, perhaps more than any other, takes account of the hardships of the life for the majority of people in Jesus' own time and in the subsequent decades. Times were not easy when Luke's gospel was gathered together. So what is at the heart of this account of Jesus and his disciples' shocking behavior on the way to Jerusalem to confront political power holders and religious power holders? What does this collection of unpleasant aphorisms have to say to us? Well, the violence proposed by John and James as a response to the Samaritans' apparent inhospitality was rejected by Jesus as a solution. Well, that's no surprise. But then there's the warning to the one who wanted to follow that he might end up homeless. So beware. Following is no picnic. And then the apparent suggestion that even cultural protocols that everyone knew, even Jesus, should not be observed. Things like burying a father and saying goodbye to family. This was clearly intended to shock. And then there is the all or nothing, straight furrow, face to Jerusalem, no looking back, undeviating commitment. And I wonder about that for me. It would appear Jesus is intending to shock would-be followers with his talk of homelessness and overturning of core values and practices. He's attacking the priorities that hold the social order of his day in place. As recipients of generations of family wisdom and patterning and established obligations, it shocks us too to imagine that our family and our way of doing things and our priorities may not be as important as we thought and may in fact need a rethink. And the question is, and Jesus asks it, are we prepared to give up old habits that go nowhere, just repeating what we've done before? Are we prepared to give up those habits that go no further than reinforcing the status quo? Are we prepared to give that up and to move on to more life-giving, life-changing ways? That's what the bit about leaving the dead to bury the dead is all about. Leave behind those who have no heart for change. It would appear that all that we hold dear might need to be changed if we intend to become part of the entourage that, along with Jesus, makes its way metaphorically to Jerusalem, sets our face toward the seat of political and religious power. Things might need to change for us. That is, if we really intend to enact the priorities of nonviolence, if we really intend to respect difference, if we really intend the incorporation of those we have marginalized by our economic priorities, if we really intend to walk the path of justice-making love. These things are demanded of us time and time again in the good news that Jesus proclaimed. For the most part, we do intend to enact these behaviours and priorities in what we say and do. But as church and as individuals, it's often easier to talk about them than it is to do them. As I contemplate this, I'm aware that we, the church, we good people of faith and commitment, are rather predisposed to leaping all too readily to aligning ourselves with Jesus, thinking, yay, we're the ones who, like him, need to do a bit of shocking. We need to do a bit of pointing out where things need to change. We need to do a bit of confronting. But the shockwave that heralds change to the priorities that we have currently set for our economy, for our social organisation, for the way we invite and welcome strangers is upon us. The shockwave is upon us. We all know that what we know of love and respect and kindness and a fair go is in upheaval. We need to look to each other for courage now to make up our minds how we want to respond in the face of that shock. It's not easy or straightforward. Following Jesus is a risky business. We might lose our economic security and our social status. Beneath these stories in which Jesus is seen apparently behaving so badly is a challenge that comes to us through the centuries, a challenge to racial preferment, a challenge to the boundaries of nations, a challenge to the priorities and certainties of cultural, family, and even national values and protocols, a challenge to the use of violence to defend what we believe is ours or our due. It seems to me it is us, you and me, that need to have our complacency rattled, to become shocked to our very core at what our society has come to. We need to be on the receiving end of the shocking utterances of Jesus that come to us through the voices of the hundreds sleeping rough on our streets, the thousands of children and their families that live in poverty, the voices of those with vulnerable mental health states, abandoned or incarcerated. It's you and me that will have to respond to Jesus' challenge as to where our priorities lie and how much risk we are prepared to take. It seems a visceral shock at the dire situation of our planet and the desperate circumstances of so many of our brothers and sisters is what we need to pray for. Because such a shock just might galvanize us into action. Here at St. Matthew's, we say we have chosen the way of Jesus. God help us as we find the courage to open our hearts and our eyes to that way here in our city.